they've got very strongly entwined. But I wanted to mention the other land struggles to show that, to just basically put forward the point that the struggles that we have been involved in have gone beyond just what is known in West Bengal as the very, very landmark kind of struggles. Now, what we have learned through these struggles is, one thing that we have learned is that what we found was that there was absolutely no legitimate forum where people could express their resentment for these projects. There is absolutely, within the existing law, within the existing framework of functioning in this so-called democracy, there are no legitimate forums where people whom, as Dr. Fernandez said, are voiceless, can actually go and express their resentment for a project or their opposition to it. The Land Acquisition Act, under which all this land is being acquired, till now, there is no new Land Acquisition Act as yet, has no room for a no. I mean, people can go, there is a procedure of hearings, there is a procedure which involves all that, but there is only a procedure where people can go and discuss the amount of compensation that they are getting, and that also only landowners. There is no room for people to go and say, we do not want this project. There is no room in the law for that. And there is no room in the law at present, till now, for people who are not landowners to have any voice. So people who are landless, agricultural workers who depend on that land for their livings, people who are sharecroppers, people who are tenants, and India and especially Bengal has very complicated leasing arrangements, many of them which are verbal. There is no room for them to express their views on these projects. And the other forums that you have, for example, there is a Panchayat Act. In tribal areas there is a PISA, which is much stronger, but in the areas which I am talking about, these are not tribal areas, these are not PISA areas, which are special areas where there are special laws that apply. In these areas, though there is a Panchayat Act, and though in West Bengal there is a provision for a Gram Sansad, which is the lowest rung, which is the voters' assembly, to meet every 6 months and decide about planning in their area. In none of these areas was any kind of consultation done with the Gram Sabha or the Gram Sansad to find out what they wanted and what they would like in their area, whether they wanted these projects or not. Similarly, we have found in the courts of law, in many of these, especially in the Swingur case, there has been a lot of legal wrangling around that particular plot of land. In the courts of law also, this whole resentment for this project or this not wanting this project, there is no provision in law for it also. And in fact, it has gone to the extent where a new government has come in, the Trinamool Congress has come in, and has tried to pass a law which invalidates the acquisition that had taken place earlier of this land. That law itself has become a point of contention and does not seem to be standing in, it doesn't stand as being constitutionally correct, but it is being challenged in the courts of law. So from the legal point of view also, it is very difficult for people who are being displaced by these projects to actually have any voice to talk about. In addition, what we have found in these projects is that, for example, my union fights for work, for wages, all those kinds of things, for the implementation of various government schemes and all. The kind of repression that comes at that point and the kind of conflict that one gets into is hardly anything compared to when you are in a displacement project. In a displacement project, it seems as if one is against a wall, where the law, the police, the corporates, the media, all of them have a very, very, very strong role in repressing what you're trying to do. So the law is used very easily, cases are put on you very, very quickly. The media portrays whatever is happening in a particular way, depending on their affiliations. And the kinds of conflicts that come up and the kinds of forces one has to fight against are very different from when you're trying to fight for an Employment Guarantee Act, 100 days of work, or your ration shop or whatever. It seems as if you're really questioning the system, and I think these struggles do actually question the system, because they're questioning the way in which development is taking place in this country and what is going to happen to the benefits of those developments. So the resistance is also a great, very huge step. And that's why I come to the third point, which I'd like to make, which is that for a non-party organization, which is the kind of organization that we belong to, or for people who do not want to go into party politics, there becomes a problem of negotiating space there. We've had, in West Bengal, we've had the present ruling party coming into power on the shoulders of these struggles. They have reached their seats of power on the shoulders of these struggles. And in the early struggles also we have found that we have to in some way, as a non-party organization, as an organization which is not in vote politics, we have to negotiate spaces with these people. For example, in Kulpi, which predates these struggles, our campaign had to finally ensure that the local MLA was defeated in elections to actually make the trust struggle a success. So we may not have stood for elections ourselves, but we had to do that. In Singur and Nandigram, the people made a very definite choice. They started off as non-party, all-party forums, all-party struggles. But people, whether out of choice or out of compulsion or whatever, definitely took a partisan stand at one time. They started supporting the TMC, and there was very little space left at that stage for any kind of non-party negotiation there. On the other hand, it was very clear that in these struggles itself, the fact that there were non-party organizations involved, not just us but other organizations also, meant that we were able to raise questions and push the agenda a bit further than what the political party would have liked to do. So for people in these struggles, they have to be part of the real politics and the political, political negotiations, political fights that are going on around them, the partisan politics that are going around them. And they have to become a part of that, and they have to negotiate spaces within that, which is a very, very tough thing for them. Because if you look at what is happening at present for the Singur people, I'm sure that they have a great sense of, failure, a great sense of, because the Singur people have still not got back their land. There is still this court case going on with the Tatas, there is still this negotiation with the Tatas. And it seems in 2008, when Tatas left that place, and there was this final agreement with the government that 400 acres would be given back to the people, we had put forward the proposal to the people that they should occupy the land, which was an extra legal way of doing things, which obviously a political party which is wanting to get into power will never support. We found no support for that proposition, very little support from the people, because they were very afraid of what that would lead to. Until today, these people are outside that land because they did not follow, because there is no legal way for them to get back that land. There seems to be no legal way of getting back that land, and they're not willing to follow this kind of extra legal thing, nor is their political party willing to follow that, because it involves a questioning of the system to a much larger extent than they are willing to do. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that these struggles are very difficult, very harsh, much harsher and much more, involving much more repression than there would be normally. And we do not seem as yet, as a country, to actually be able to handle this kind of problem. I don't think even the new Land Acquisition Act that is coming in, or the new ways in which they are trying to sort of increase amounts of compensation are actually going to satisfy people. And this whole thing has to be dealt with in a way where we actually start questioning the very kind of development that we are having in this country. Until and unless we question that, and we change the equation to become a much more just equation, we're not going to be able to handle the conflicts which are coming out through these displacement struggles. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to now turn to our third speaker, Jahan Pereira, who is the director of the National Peace Council in Colombo, Sri Lanka, who will talk, I think, mostly about conflict-induced displacement.
I would like to first start by thanking MCRG for inviting me to take part in this international conference with scholars from different parts of India and also the world, and thereby keep Sri Lanka in the international focus. Now, the main source of displacement in Sri Lanka has been civil strife. You might know that there was a war that lasted about 3 decades in Sri Lanka, an internal war, a civil war, which led to mass displacements, acts of terrorism, great loss of life. and there were periods in which about 1.5 million people were displaced out of a population of 20 million. Of course, by Indian standards, maybe these are rather tiny figures. But for Sri Lanka, that was a very significant amount of displacement. Now, the main reasons for the displacement, there were three reasons. One was the military operations that took place. The most notorious example was the last one in 2009, when the Sri Lankan military started to enter the territory that was controlled by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. LTT had effectively taken control of about 20% of Sri Lankan territory. It had really formed a separate country, except that the international community was not recognizing it. The Sri Lankan army started to go in, and with a lot of firepower in this final battle. The LTT started to withdraw, and in their withdrawal, they also took the civilian population with them. There was a lot of dispute at that time as to why the civilians were withdrawing, because some people said that the civilians were withdrawing because LTT were their children. They were also frightened of the invading Sri Lankan military, which was from a different ethnic composition. The Sri Lankan military is like 99% Sinhala. Sinhala people are the majority in Sri Lanka. LTT was 100% Tamil. But now in retrospect, we would see it is the case that the LTT were actually holding human shields. And in the final battle, there were 300,000 civilians and about 20,000 LTT fighters in a small territory. And the international community urged Sri Lanka at that time, negotiate with them. Don't send the military in. But the Sri Lankan position was that we have negotiated with the LTT in the past 5 times, all 5 times negotiated broke down. This time we must finish it off. They sent the army in. And they won the war. The amount of civilian casualties, we are not sure, no one knows, because the media was not permitted in. There were no independent witnesses. As a result, there is today an international call for war crimes investigations into Sri Lanka. The second reason for displacement is that the military also took over a lot of land belonging to civilians to protect their military camps. The reason being that the LTT used to go into villages, Tamil villages, station long-range artillery and fire into the Sri Lankan army camps. Then the Sri Lankan military took over all that land. They expanded the military camps by saying that they needed high security zones around the camps. The third form of displacement took place due to ethnic cleansing. There were some incidents where there was inter-community conflict also, like for instance, the LTT expelled 100,000 Muslims from the north on the grounds that they were a potential fifth column. Now, although the war has ended 3.5 years ago, and life has improved tremendously in Sri Lanka compared to what it was, there's a lot of development, there's no terrorism, the government says peace has come, there is increasing tourism. We had 1 million tourists come recently to Sri Lanka. However, the displacement remains a serious problem. The reason is that although the war ended, there is no political solution that addresses the roots of the conflict, therefore no reconciliation, no trust. Because there is no trust, the military does not want to leave the north. The high security zones still are there in place. The military machine of the government is still intact. Now, as in all conflicts, the causes are many, and there are more than 2 sides. Shortly after the end of the war, the Sri Lankan government appointed a Lessons Learned Commission, Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, to go into why the war happened, what actually happened during the war. Now, the real reason that the government did that is because they were worried about the international community coming in, the UN coming in, and investigating the charges of war crimes. So they wanted to appoint their own internal body. The LLRC made 2 important findings. One finding was that at the end of the war, the country has gone back to 1948 1948 is the time we attained independence. And the LLRC said the challenge at that time was how to create a united Sri Lankan nation. That challenge still remains unaddressed. And the challenge is that in Sri Lanka we have an ethnic majority of 75%, we have ethnic minorities of 25%, how to share power equitably between them so that decisions are made together and not by the ethnic majority. The problem with the ethnic majority is a permanent majority, never changes. It can become a tyranny of the majority. So that is one challenge that remains. The answer that the LLRC gave was there are two ways in which we can move towards a political solution. One is devolving power to the regions so that the regions in which the minorities are a majority, they will be able to determine life for themselves. Second, having independent institutions like independent Supreme Court, independent public service, so that is not politicized. However, the Sri Lankan government's strategy, post-war strategy for the future is the complete opposite of what the LLRC is recommending. The Sri Lankan government strategy is that after the war, what Sri Lanka needs is to make up for the lost years of development. We need to develop fast. We need to get our economy going. We need to improve the livelihoods of people, like in East Asia. We need to centralize power. So instead of devolution of power, there is centralization of power. There is a weakening of the existing system of devolution, which was promoted by the Indian government in 1987 under the Indo-Lanka Peace Accord, which set up a system of government fairly similar to that of India, but which had never really been implemented. And with regard to the setting up of need for countervailing institutions of power, such as the Supreme Court and independent public service, our Chief Justice right now is in the process of being impeached because the Supreme Court has been ruling against the government, and the government thinks that the Supreme Court is an obstacle to its development. So now we are seeing signs once again of an old cycle being repeated, the vicious cycle in the north, in Jaffna, in the Tamil areas. Students once again are commemorating the LTTE. They call them the ones who fought for them, whom the government calls terrorists. The government in turn arrests the students and says LTT is trying to resurrect. Terrorism is about to come again. In turn, the Tamil parties, the political parties, stage satyagrahas, peaceful demonstrations. The government breaks them up. So we see signs again that what happened in the past is being reproduced. So in this context, I want to thank MRG again for inviting me, because when the answer is not coming from within a society, then the answer has to come from outside of society. So we look to the international community for lessons, assistance, and inspiration. And there is nothing wrong. It is not a treacherous act to do so, because human rights are universal. But our government says that those of us who come and appeal to the international community are actually traitors. So it is in that context that we are working, and I'm happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Thanks. These three remarkable presentations, and I thank all of you for staying within the time limits to give us quite a lot of time for discussion, raised a number of important issues, and I perhaps will start by asking you to reflect a little bit more on some of the themes that came through all three presentations. I was struck by the extent that all of you really focused on how marginalization of specific populations have been a part of this whole process of displacement, talking about tribal groups, ethnic minorities, the landless. And so this intersection of class and displacement in the context of both development and conflict, I think, is an important theme of the presentations. A second theme, I think, is the difficulty of finding just and lasting solutions for those who are displaced, whether it's because the development paradigm itself is problematic, so therefore impedes the solutions, or because the, as I think you eloquently said, that peace may not necessarily mean political solutions for the future. I think all of you touched on the role of political activists in terms of in the struggle to find solutions, both in stopping the displacement, but also in finding longer-term options for those who have been displaced. And then the third theme that I think was in a way the most frightening of the presentations is the potential for extremism or terrorism to emerge out of these situations when there are no political solutions or effective economic solutions for those who are displaced. But I maybe come back to the theme of marginalization and perhaps talking, we tend in this group to look at those who are the victims of processes and how the displaced themselves are marginalized. But perhaps in your work you could talk a little bit more about how you're dealing with marginalized populations in terms of the causes and solutions to displacement. So perhaps we start in the order that we began in. To talk a little bit more about your findings in terms of the marginalized population.
I would rather speak about marginalization itself as different from impoverishment. Impoverishment is economic. That's the first step of marginalization. And it's greater among the subaltern groups than among the dominant groups. Now, marginalization is social, psychological, cultural. That is, the subaltern groups that are displaced, deprived of their material livelihood, accept that their subordination through both psychologically and culturally. You find it, first of all, in the value system. Tribals who have for centuries protected their forests and other natural resources as renewable are deprived of their resources and exploit the little that they have. That is left over, overexploit those resources for daily income. So what is a resource for the future becomes only a source of present income. And that's not true only about the environmental resources, but also about the human resources. Children cease to be the hope for the future. They become commodities for the present because adults are deprived of work. The access to work goes down from about 90% to about 45%. 50% don't have access to work. The rest experience downward occupational mobility. So two sources are used. The children who are the hope of the future become sources of income for the present, and the second source is the woman's body. Prostitution grows enormously among the displaced because there's no other income. So the whole value system of the resource, human and material, changes completely. Together with that comes the acceptance of the dominant values. To give but one example, we saw again and again tribal women who have a higher social status than dominant class women because of their history, which is linked to the resource that is taken away from them. They are active economic assets. They are deprived of their livelihood, they cease to be active economic assets, become dependents and housewives alone, and we saw again and again these women saying, after all, accepting the dominant theme that after all, women's place is in the kitchen, or we are not intelligent enough to get those jobs. They cease to consider themselves active human communities, accept their subordination, and that is what I call marginalization, social, psychological, cultural. So the search for alternatives has to be not merely material projects, but also a whole new ideology, a new psychological, a new sociological, a new cultural approach. Thank you.
The projects I talked about, or the examples that I gave, in most of these cases, excepting for Bahadurpur, actually people were, and to some extent the people of Singur, people were not displaced. So I don't think we actually came across in such strong terms the experiences that Dr. Walter Fernandez was talking about. But there were definitely other processes which took place there, which were processes of marginalization. For example, people who were resisting these projects were portrayed by the media and by the state as a whole as barriers to development. So they were portrayed as being anti-progress or anti-development. And that portrayal itself is in a way, I would say, the kind of psychological social marginalization that Dr. Fernandez is talking about, that took place. The other thing that happened in these projects was, especially in Singur and Nandigram, was there was not just and some others also, there was not just discussion on economic rehabilitation. In fact, economic rehabilitation was just one part of what people wanted, better compensation. In many of these projects, there was this whole questioning of the entire development paradigm and of wanting more of an agriculture-based, more of a natural-based development, and industrialization which was democratic, which was pro-people, where the benefits would actually accrue to the people themselves. And in this case, also I think, post these struggles, there has been a breaking of expectations, in the sense that people have not found that what has come out of these struggles is actually fulfilling the aspirations that they had. For example, for the people of Nandigram, they may have been able to stop an SEZ from coming up there, and they may still be on their lands. But they also expected a better governance, which they have not got. They also expected less corruption from the new government that would come in, the new panchayat that would come in. That has not happened. And there is quite a bit of resentment of that amongst the people. So that is another kind of, I would say, another kind of expectation that people have not been able to, that has not been met through these struggles. And another thing that has happened, at least here, is that one kind of marginalization that has taken place is, when these struggles were taking place, it was people in the lead. People were leading these struggles. And there was a great sense of empowerment amongst them. And they felt that they were being able to decide what was going to happen to them. There was a lot of fear, a lot of problem with the amount of repression that was going on, but there was also a sense of power. Because people were organized, people were being able to confront the police, people were being able to confront the state. That sense of power has also gone. And I think in a number of cases, people have begun to feel pawns in a political game. That kind of feeling, I think, has been there among some of these people, which in a sense would also be a way of being kind of marginalized in a situation which was actually empowering, but in the end, you end up feeling that, well, you were used. That is the kind of feeling I think a number of people have had.
At one level, it is the ethnic minorities in Sri Lanka who are marginalized, because their political representatives are always outnumbered in parliament. But even within the ethnic majority, we will find large numbers of people in actual fact being marginalized. They are very poor, and the poverty in their areas is sometimes as bad as in the areas where the ethnic minorities live. In addition, intellectually too, they are marginalized. Why are they marginalized? Because all that they hear about what's happening in the country, about the developments, about politics, about reform, is what the government says. Government media is very powerful. Government knows how to also intimidate and silence the independent media. So our work is primarily educational. The work that my organization does is primarily educational. And at this time, the device we have hit upon is to take the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission report and explain it to the people. Now, as I said, the government came up with this LLRC report to, as an answer to the international community's charge of war crimes. And indeed, the LLRC exculpated, excused the government on the grounds of war crimes. It said the government is not guilty of war crimes because prior to every military operation, the government insisted that the highest priority should be given to civilian safety, and therefore government is not guilty of war crimes. But on everything else, LLRC has came up with recommendations that went beyond our expectations. They said what civil society groups are talking about the need for good governance, about the need for political reform. So now we are able to take that message to the people and say this is what our own commission, our own government-appointed commission has said. It's not what NGOs are saying, it is not what the international community is saying. However, when I do this work, I sometimes think of the child in the story of St. Augustine. Apparently when he was thinking of really about the meaning of life, he saw a little child on the beach taking water from the sea and pouring it into a hole because he wanted to empty the sea apparently into the hole, something like that. And I sometimes feel that that is what we are also doing. And I'm still not sure what the answer to St. Augustine's dilemma was, what his dream was, but he did get an answer, and I too am waiting for that answer.
Why don't we open this up to the audience, and I'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then please introduce yourself, and if the question is aimed towards a specific speaker, please indicate that. And are there microphones?
Yeah, they should. My microphone.
There's one person. Okay. Could you raise your hands again? Okay, right on this, right there. Yes, please.
I have a question for Professor Fernandez and I have a question for Jahan. For Professor Fernandez, you marvelously depicted the status quo, the situation with IDPs. What is your solution? What do you propose? And also for Jahan on war crimes, because according to Rome Statute for International Criminal Court, there are different categories of war crimes that unfortunately happened in Sri Lanka and by the Sri Lankan government and army. And how is the status of impunity there? Or is there any attempt to address the problem of impunity?
Thank you. Who else? In the front, please. Nazreen.
Hi, I'm Nasreen from the university. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I have a question for Jan Pereira actually. I'm kind of curious as to, in your work and your interaction, what is the nature of the youth, especially in post-conflict scenario? Do you see an emphasis or a movement towards reconciliation? Especially there seems to be presently the society, is it divided? Are they really working towards some kind of reconciliation in post-war kind of a period right now? And if so, is there any kind of educational movement in place, especially in textbook where you probably see that Tamils are being deliberately being incorporated, they don't feel a sense of alienation. So is there been any kind of textbook kind of reform? Is the government looking for that? Or, I mean, I know probably they're not, they aren't, but if you have come across anything, it would be nice to hear about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Right behind. No, I'm sorry. Catty corner behind.
Thank you. I'm Rakhi. I teach in Guwahati in the northeast of India. My question is to Jahan Pereira. I'm a little curious about this whole transition from conflict to peace. We in the northeast are caught between a similar situation such as yours. My thoughts are directed to the particular kind of conflict between civilian emphasis on the need for peace and the government's emphasis on development. So, in this tussle, do you find a civilian a kind of attempt to sort of look at laws in the increased militarization that you're suggesting, that the environment that you suggested looks like having a more increased emphasis on military presence now? Does it seem that since war is ended technically, is the civilian population looking at laws which need to be broken? Is there an emphasis by civilians to bring awareness to unjust laws? Because we have a similar situation in our part of the country. Thank you.
Do all the way in the back, on the right side, and then we'll take one more on the left side. I'm sorry, my right, right there.
I am Nirmal Bhairathi from the Times of India. I have got a question for Mr. Talwar. So, latest land-related conflict here in West Bengal is possibly Loba in Birbhum district, where the previous situation is that a mining project is to come up. A coal mining project, coal has been found, where people want to give their land, but they are not getting the right price. And they are saying that the company, they have given it to a private company to develop the land, that the company has not consulted the people, and they have consulted the administration and fixed a price which people are not accepting. So have you studied this Loba situation? And my another question is whether the government in this situation should intervene on behalf of the people in negotiating, or it should have a hands-on policy which this present government is pursuing.
And then I believe we have one over here.
Thank you. I'm Katrina Brun from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. I have a question, or I'm seeking advice from Jahan Pereira. You ended your talk saying that you can't see from answers inside the country, you have to go outside, so you urge the international community to engage. But I think all of us in the international community, international researchers, at the moment are a bit at loss on how to engage in Sri Lanka, and it would be very good to get some advice on how we can continue our engagement.
Okay, why don't we stop with these questions, and then hopefully we'll have time for another round, and I'm going to do it in the reverse order, particularly since many questions were addressed to you.
So with regard to how Sri Lanka is addressing the issue of war crimes, we are addressing it politically. Sri Lanka is addressing it politically by arguing that the war crimes that Sri Lanka committed are no greater than the war crimes that X number of countries committed. And secondly, we are getting the backing, at least we think we are, getting the backing of China and Russia. Sri Lanka has moved very close to China. China is coming in a big way economically into Sri Lanka. With regard to impunity, the government says, what's that, punish? There were no war crimes, really. The war was fought, it was a terrible war, LTT was worse than the Sri Lankan soldiers. So they denied that these acts of great human rights violations took place. Although the LLRC, the Lessons Learned Commission report, handles it a little differently. It says, as a matter of policy, the Sri Lankan government gave highest priority to the civilian safety. We accepted, says the LLRC. However, it says, when we went around the country, we realized that terrible thing actually had happened. We want these incidents investigated. That's how the LLRC put it, but government is not doing anything about it at the moment. Reconciliation among youth, there are small NGO groups, but it's like our group. The vast majority of youth are trying to make a living. They are not terribly interested in these political issues, and their leaders, political leaders, are not giving them the message of reconciliation. The textbook reform is not taking place, and it won't take place because really this government, in order to defeat LTT is a very nationalistic force. I mean, so nationalistic that they were able to induce young Tamils to commit suicide, to fight with cyanide capsules around their neck for the sake of the motherland. To defeat this force, the Sri Lanka government, this Sri Lanka government, generated an equal nationalism among the Sinhalese. So, this government that won the war is the government that remains today in power. This government does not think in terms of a multi-ethnic, plural society like we think. It thinks of a Sinhala nation. So, no textbook reform. The government's emphasis on development versus the civilians' need for peace. The problem here is our society is ethnically polarized. The ethnic majority is being fed with nationalism and fear of the ethnic minority, of the possibility of the Tamils starting terrorism again, the diaspora supporting the LTT, the international community being against Sri Lanka, wanting to divide us. That's the message that goes. So when you say this, so the civilians are really, they follow the government lead. By and large, they follow the government lead. Now the ethnic minority, the Tamils, they would like to use the courts. And the courts have been standing up, which is why our Chief Justice is about to be impeached. So in Northeast India, perhaps the situation is a little different because they are within each state, the people may be more united against the central government. In Sri Lanka, it's a small country, so while the Tamils are united, the Sinhalese are not united with the Tamils in asking for the laws to be implemented in favor of minority rights. And how can the international community engage? I think you engage by engaging in dialogue, but also by holding the Sri Lanka government to international standards. I think it is only because of international pressure that Sri Lanka appointed this Lessons Learned Commission. Otherwise, it wouldn't have appointed the Lessons Learned Commission. It wouldn't have released their report like India does. India also had appointed a commission to investigate Kashmir, but I believe it never released the report. It was supposed to be a very good report that came out. It was not released by the government of India. Sri Lanka also wouldn't have released its LLRC report if once it read it, it wouldn't have released it. The only reason it released it because of international pressure, because of Geneva, because of UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and the fear that the UN might order an international probe into Sri Lanka. So the international pressure did deliver something. So I would say that dialogue plus holding Sri Lanka to international standards, because we are a part of international society.
As far as the state's role is concerned, I mean, as in Balo was saying, that we have this example of Lobha right now, and then a number of other examples where the government has now taken the stand in many places that we are not going to do any acquisition for any private company. So they've gone from one extreme, for example, especially the West Bengal government has gone from one extreme where the former government was acquiring land actively for private companies to a situation now where they're taking a totally hands-off policy. The second, this hands-off policy in a situation where there is an unequal power equation, where institutions function against the poor, whether it's the panchayat, whether it's the courts, whether it's the media or whatever. There's generally an anti-poor, these people are seen as being anti-development, and there's generally not much support of them. And in that kind of, and the corporates are also very, very good and very, very organized in the way in which they can acquire, they can take this land, and land mafia generally steps into these situations. For the state to take a hands-off role is basically again to support the corporates. And that is what we are seeing happening actually. For example, in Kulpi, the port against which we have been fighting for a long time, the government has taken the stand that they will not acquire land for anybody. But we have seen land mafia walking in there and acquiring and buying 550 acres, using guns, using threats, using money, buying off police, buying off the local administration also, and setting up Benami companies to buy all this land. So here, I mean, the situation is no better. With the state, in fact, going away and the government saying that we are not going to acquire land, you have an equally unscrupulous lot of people guided by the corporate, funded by the corporate coming in and taking over land. So the role of the government is definitely not a hands-off role. It has to be the role of a watchdog which actually works in favor of the people and sees that the interests of the poorest people in the country or whose lands are being acquired or who are being displaced, their interests are guarded. I don't think a hands-off policy works here. A hands-off policy is basically a policy in favor of the rich.
Well, what is the solution? Now, particularly with globalization, liberalization making matters worse for the marginalized groups, greater land acquisition, I almost feel like that child in St. Augustine's story. However, we have to work on alternatives, which is a long-term process. Alternatives at three levels, I feel. One at the ground level, grassroots level, where be it the self-help groups, the women's organization, and the whole set of groups finding local level solutions and forming alliances there to search for another type of development, which is a long and slow process, but there's no alternative to that. Two, at the policy level, I see all this research and link up with social activists, displaced persons, legal activists, and some good elements in the administration as a putting pressure on the state to change policies in favor of the poor. That is a very low process because we have been attempting this alternative land law and land act and policy for the last 20 years. There was a big alliance of thousands of persons, researchers, legal activists, social activists, displaced persons, etc. We have not achieved even 40% of what we were trying to get. But I think we have to keep pushing in that direction. And the third is getting rid of this eminent domain, having a new legal system which recognizes, which is a rights-based system, recognizes people's livelihood as a right. And that's another area we have been pushing it. It's a combination of all these that has to work towards a solution. And that's a long-term project. It's not for tomorrow.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, so if there are any remaining questions, yes, in the back. And then one in the front.
I am Pari Velan. I work for QASS Mumbai. I'm back to question to Mr. Ferreira. Regarding the Sri Lanka, the context of the entire discussion, we are talking about war, post-war. We will seldom talking about the very cause of this conflict. To go back, the post-independence. 1956, the introduction of Sinhala language only. 1971, I think Buddhism was a primary language. And the other series of discriminations in education, employment were some of the reasons why this very, civil strife started. But even before this armed form of it, earlier it was more of a peaceful form, constitutional means. All these failed in the 60s and 70s. That's why probably the 80s and 90s were dominated by the conflict. Of course, then you have both the sides, the state and the non-state actors, equally engaged in violations and things like that. Now, bringing all this in the context and in the post-war scenario, what I would like to ask is, definitely accountability is an important thing. we have severe human rights violations, international humanitarian laws are being violated, and we are very well quoted LLRC.
Nepal and India, the 1950 Treaty of Nepal and India, which doesn't consider Nepali as refugees in India. And we have almost 1700 kilometers of open border between Nepal and India, and you can cross to India from any point. So there is no proper checkpoint. So most of the people who displaced from Nepal, they just simply travel to India because they think that at least it's a Nepali society, small society, they feel safe to go to India and work whatever they can do. So that's why if you look at the displacement data of Nepal, there are people say that it's from 200,000 to 2.4 million. So the problem of data in Nepal is big when it comes to internal displacement. And of course, there are displacement of project displacement, which I'll be talking in my presentation after the lunch. And also, there are displacement due to blood, so I'll not go into detail of that. And the conflict-induced displacement, which I'll be linking with the women's issue later, are three in Nepali context. Like especially, it started from 1996 with the Maoist movement, and as a result of the 10-year civil war in Nepal. And also, there are what you call the ethnic movement in down south in Nepal and in eastern hills of Nepal. So these three conflicts have produced these like 200,000 to 2.4 million displacement in Nepal. And the research shows that out of the total displaced people, there are 75 to 80% are women and children. And out of them, these women are the kind of worst victimized by the displacement issue in Nepal. And I try to like when I was doing the research on 1325 a couple of years ago, and also my organization works with the women in different parts of the country, and I happen to interact with many women in different parts of the country. There are so many issues that women face as a result of the conflict. Like one of the major issues, as I started with the story, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse of women in what we call in the place of origin and place of destination. I'm sorry to say that one of the major perpetrators of against women are the security forces, especially during the 10 years wars between the Maoists and the government. They were given kind of free license to do whatever they want, and they were really known to be brutal, especially during that time with women and with men also. It was very good excuse that you say, okay, you are Maoist, so you can do whatever you can. You just tell them that, accuse them of being Maoist, and you are free to do anything with these people, be women or men. And also, there are a lot of cases, especially when I was doing the research in 2025, I had interaction with a lot of women leaders and some women that, there were so many what you call single mother, which is very, very socially unacceptable category in Nepali Hindu society. And there are a lot of single women because they were raped by military and the police, and they transferred to somewhere else. So you don't even know where are they now, and they have children now. And there is a term used for those children who do not have kind of known father, and they call it batase. Batase is the word you call heir in Nepal. In Nepal. So these children has to live that kind of stigma throughout their life. And also there are women victim of women also have kind of they lost their husband. There are a lot of single women, and there are women are suffering from reproductive health, and the issue of uterine prolapse has been coming so much in Nepali society. And also they are the kind of the lot of maternal mortality rate, and they are also trafficking in sexual exploitation. The historically Nepal's the trafficking belt is the central Nepal, central hills of Nepal. Now, especially during the Maoist insurgency, the HIV prevalence and the trafficking cluster shifted to Midwestern parts of Nepal, which is the kind of Maoist area where a lot of people were displaced from that region to Nepal and to India also. And now this is somehow summary of how women suffered during the conflict. And let me go to the question of participation. There are some positive points also after the conflict, like now at least the constitution recognizes that women, there should be a 33% women representation in all state mechanisms. There were women, 33% women in the kind of defunct Constituent Assembly, which is already dissolved. And there was also provision for that 33% women in the local peace committees in Nepal, and also but the problem is, one of the Norwegian ambassadors once told that Nepal is very good in producing documents, but they are really poor in implementing those documents. Now, as Ms. Rakhi earlier pointed out, we are the first in producing a national plan of action on UNSCR 1325 in Nepal, first in South Asia, and I think third in the entire Asia. But when it comes to implementation, I was doing the research on 1325 and the women, especially when I was talking with the people in the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction, which is the kind of implementing agency of the UNSCR 1325 and the National Plan of Action, and the level of knowledge and their understanding and their attitudes towards women participation promoting women is a pathetic one. So I think I'll stop here and I'll maybe respond to the questions later. Thank you.
Inevitably, whenever we talk about women's issues within conflict, what comes through is a narrative of victimization, a narrative of rape, of what happens, And as Gina says, it saddens us, yet being a woman should be euphoric, not saddening. And all these women have done a lot and worked against them. They're not, and in the first round we didn't have this narrative of what was actually being done, and even Shiva can say a lot about what is actually being done in this, in this region in terms of protest. So in the next round I would request the speakers to maybe think about that aspect as well, but because we have such short a time, this is just one of the questions that I leave. Now I open it up to the broader audience. Vanita. Vanita and then somebody there. Okay. And Stephen. Oh, Nirmal, go start.
I think point is not actually a question but a comment to Rakhi Kalita's presentation. When